Our last speaker is Chris Troyanos. He's the medical coordinator of the Boston Marathon and the executive director of International Institute for Race Medicine. And his presentation is about endurance medicine outcomes and global weather changes. So pretty intriguing stuff. And here is Chris himself.
Paco, to the Ames board, to the Tallinn Marathon Organizing Committee, and to invited guests. It is an honor to be here representing the International Institute for Race Medicine, but also my colleagues back home in Boston. Today's, well, before I get into today's lecture, a couple of things. The relationship we've had with Ames is probably, I think, Dave, what, about 3 years old, I would say? And thanks to Dave Kunde and his leadership in getting us involved with this organization, we have grown, we have learned from each other. Ames, we feel, is kind of the medical resource for Ames members and marathons throughout the world, and trying to help really create standards of care and what is needed within the industry. So Dave, thank you very much for getting us to this point, and more things to come, and I know we've only scratched the surface about what we're doing. You know, throughout the whole course of the day, listening to the speakers, one thing has been very evident is that road racing, marathoning, is big business. You look at the industry, what you're doing, the economic impact on the cities and the towns that you host your events in, the charitable causes that are supported. It has grown tremendously. And, you know, my goal as I do this with this institute and the races that I'm involved with is making sure that the medical program holds up its end of the bargain. Because let's face it, medical is a part of everyone's event, but a bad medical outcome can have a negative impact on what you're doing. And that's what we try to prevent from happening. So very important. I've been lucky enough to be involved in this industry for, I guess you could say, 40 years. Boston Marathon, I just completed my 42nd Boston Marathon, first as a volunteer, 23 years as the medical coordinator, which what I do is I lead everything that happens medically at that event. But in addition to the marathon, I also do a multitude of smaller events. Some are 10Ks with 5, 6, 7,000 people. So, you know, as Mike mentioned in his speech, scalability is important. So even though, you know, I'm dealing with a big event like the Boston Marathon, it's important that you understand that I can make what we do medically go to any size event. Multiply, just taking it down to a scale that's going to work. It's going to work for your event, and it's also going to work for your budget. Many of the things that Mike mentioned. Mike, by the way, that was a great presentation that you did. Thank you for stepping on half of my slides, but that's okay. We'll make it work. You know, my talk today is going to be about weather and climate change. So the one thing I'm not going to stand up here and do is debate whether global warming is a true thing or not. I'll let the scientists and you determine that. But I think from my perspective, and maybe yours as well, I think we can agree that this planet that we're living on is changing. And it's changing on a regular basis, and weather being a major part of that. The impact that weather has been having on our population on a massive scale is causing issues. And I have to believe, and I've seen it in most of the events that I've been dealing with, it's causing problems with our events. How are we responding to it? So things like coastal flooding, we're starting to see more of that. Rain, you know, again, I'm not going to sit here and again tell you that, you know, the sky is falling, but what I want to do with this presentation is maybe ring a little bit of a bell to ask you as event and race directors, are you dealing with, are you addressing these types of problems? And how are you addressing them? So when we're seeing rain events, you know, this 1 or 2 inches, you know, a storm is kind of unusual. We're seeing 5, 6, even more inches of rain causing flooding, causing all kinds of issues. How does that impact your event? Heat waves, and I'm going to get into this in much more detail later on. How is heat affecting the event, and particularly your runners, and how does that affect the medical teams? Forest fires. We've seen this obviously in Greece. I was so heartbroken to see what my home country was going through the past couple of months. Also, what's been happening in California, all the way from Los Angeles up into the Wine County area about forest fires, and how does that impact air quality, and then the events, and then the courses themselves. Droughts, seeing significant tornadoes, particularly in the Midwest of the United States, and then hurricanes. Hurricanes all over the world are much bigger. Hurricanes, typhoons, whatever you want to call them. Again, much bigger than I can remember seeing when I was much younger. So again, we're seeing these changes, and again, how do we respond? Okay. I did a little bit of a research piece to find out, okay, how much is weather really impacting our event? I could have put together 5 slides of press releases on different news reports about what was going on with weather and events. So again, there's an impact. It's happening, and I think you've all seen this. This year at the Boston Marathon, Mike had talked about learning from mistakes. Again, I've been doing this for a long time, and the one thing I will tell you is I'm not an expert at what I do. I've only made the mistakes that I don't want you to make. If I repeat them, then that's on me. When I look at the 2018 Boston Marathon, I kind of term it not a clean event. I look at all my events and, okay, did it work the way we wanted it to? Did the outcome, did our planning, did our prep work allow us to do everything we wanted? And I can tell you right now, that was not a clean event for us. In the sense that we had planned, we had talked about, but again, when, excuse me, I say this, the crap hits the fan, things don't always go the way you want. Mike and I'm going to talk about emergency action plans and all of that. You can have all those pre-planning meetings, but when something goes wrong, unexpected or expected, the boots on the ground, if they're not doing what you want, that piece of paper is worthless. So you've got to be able to deal with that. And sometimes with everything that you've done in preparation, you have to be able to deal on the fly with this. Not what you want, but it's the realistic approach to this. So, looking back at my career at Boston, how many times have we actually talked about canceling the Boston Marathon? Well, going back to 2007, high winds, almost hurricane. It was a nor'easter, basically. A nor'easter is much like a hurricane during the early months of the year for us. And we had discussions the night before about should we or shouldn't we. And it was a small group. Guy Morris, myself, Dave McGilvery, a bunch of people. And we determined that we would go with it. And of course, as the discussion's going along, Dave turns to me and says, medically, Chris, what do you think? Should we do it or not? Why does it always fall on the medical people to make that decision? But it did, and I felt that we could probably go along with it. Now, am I a meteorologist? No. And we all know that weather can change very quickly, particularly in New England. So it worked. Then fast forward, we go to 2012. Now we know we've got high heat. And what are we going to do there? Multiple meetings, discussions, do we, don't we, what are the thresholds? Everything's in place, and we decide to do it knowing how bad it was going to be. Then we get to the night before this race. Now, I'm staying at the Copley Fairmont Hotel, which is right behind the medical tent near the finish line. And as Mike mentioned, I can't sleep the night before. There's no way. So I'm up, and I'm hearing the wind gusting. And I'm on the 6th floor. So I get up, get dressed, obviously go out, and I go to the side street, which is Dartmouth Street. And I step out and I go, it's not too bad. It's a little windy, some rain, we're good. I go back up, get undressed, go back to bed, kind of tossing and turning, and the wind is just going crazy. So I get up again, get dressed, and this time I realize, not very bright at 3 o'clock in the morning, I went down the wrong street. I had to go to the opposite side of the building where it was going this way. The wind was buffeted by the building, and all of a sudden I was almost blown over. So get back into my room, get my phone, and what do? I text Dave. I said, Dave, you up? He goes, yeah, I knew. And I said to Dave, I'm not so sure about this. And he says, well, what are we going to do about it now? I said, well, it's up to us. Do we go with it or not? And we had the discussion, and we've had this discussion almost every year when we get into these situations. If we did it, what would the runners do? Would they actually heed our advice? Our feeling is, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, is that we feel thousands of runners are going to go out to Hopkinton on their own and run the race without us. So if we don't put the staffing and the support, the public safety efforts out there that we would normally do, what does that mean to the 8 cities and towns that are out there supporting us? We're leaving them holding the bag. So it's a difficult situation to understand and what we should do. And sometimes maybe we're making decisions that we weren't as conservative as we'd like to be. So again, a problem for us. We haven't canceled it yet. I don't know if we will in my career. I've got about another 4 years to go, so we'll see. So these are some slides that if you were in Greece, you're going to see again, but I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Medically, what are our risk factors? Obviously, weather. You're going to hear me talk about WGBT, wet bulb globe temperature. And again, I'll get into this in a little bit. But again, when you look at our events, what is the one thing? Again, all of you are A-type personalities. All of you are so buttoned up as race directors. You have everything in place. But the one thing you can't control is the weather. None of us can. So that's a factor that always causes us problems. Angina. Fitness levels. I don't know sometimes with even the Boston Marathon, what are the fitness levels of these runners? Even though it's a race that people say they train for, they might not. You just don't know. Course layout can be a difficult problem with some of the events. I don't know, and this is something that I think the industry needs to take a look at, is what is the medical history? I am flying blind in my medical tents. If someone comes into that medical tent, unconscious, semi-conscious, can't communicate, and I don't know if they're a diabetic, if they got a pre-existing heart condition, any of that. Why not? Why as an industry are we not asking for that in our pre-registration materials? Human threats. Again, that could be, as Mike referenced, terrorism. It could be social unrest. It could be a number of things that, again, can happen anytime, and medical has to be able to deal with that. And then the one thing that we do spend a lot of time on is how are we dealing with the volunteers, not just the medical, but all volunteers, about the logistics and the approach, the communication efforts that we take, and making sure that they're doing the right things. So pre-event goals, again, here, I know this is obviously very obvious, but medical response to all locations. Well, when you're dealing a marathon, particularly a marathon like Boston, and it's a 26.2 point-to-point, or even if it's a loop course, that's a big area to cover. So it's important for us as we design our medical programs to be able to respond in less than 4 minutes to any location to a down runner. I would never want to see that night or the next day a news report, a runner goes down, and there's no medical person around them responding. That's just something I can't stand to happen. So we want to make sure we've got enough staff to do that. We also want to make sure we're not a public safety concern. So to making sure that our medical program can mitigate the types of problems that we can see, that we're not overloading the hospitals. That's vitally important for any event in their medical planning. Mike had talked about communications, and again, this is the foundation for everything we do, whether it be logistics or medical. If your communication programs are not solid, in place, and working, then you're going to be flying blind, and then all hell is going to break loose. So again, that's a major piece. Then there's education. Boston and most of the events that I work, we try to make sure that we're spending a lot of time, as Mike referenced, with the volunteers, but we also have to educate the runners. We need to educate the runners on, okay, where are we medically? If they have a problem, what to do? How would they run in the heat? How would they run in the cold? How does medical work with them as a runner to make this work? Absolutely vital, and we spend a lot of time on that. So some of the marathon-related conditions, again, you've all seen this, dehydration, and water consumption, still something that we work on. Has a direct correlation to hyponatremia, which is, too much water. We haven't had a fatality with that since 2001. But again, for a period of time, the industry was dealing with this problem of people drinking too much. And it's still a problem and an educational approach we need to continue to work on. We all have cardiac events, and these are things that you can't control. But again, if you have the right equipment and supplies to be able to respond in an appropriate manner, important to deal with it. Talked about respiratory issues and hypothermia. And, when I go back to 2017, and again, I manage 11 events throughout the course of the year. 11's fine, I don't want any more. I looked at all those events, went back to my medical records, and I started counting how many exertional heat strokes, and I'm going to get into that specifically, what that is later. 125 in one calendar year. Now, can you imagine if, instead of saying heat strokes, that was cardiac arrest, and the press got a hold of that? What would the response be in the press about road racing and marathoning? The result would be dangerous. That's how they approach it. So what we're seeing from the medical side is, because of these climate changes, is we're seeing a massive amount of exertional heat stroke, much more than we've seen in cardiac arrest. So as events, are you able to recognize it? Are you able to treat it, understand it, and work with your public safety folks to deal with it? And again, we're going to get into what that looks like. But again, major problem for at least the events that I'm seeing in New England and even some other areas of the world. So, going back to, I always like to see what's the research, what's out there. And I can tell you right now that this industry needs to do more. As related to weather, and you can see I underlined every time this thing said performance. Well, yeah, that's nice, but I'm looking at it, what's the impact of the medical team and your race directors about how you plan for your medical programs? So I think that weather, if we do more research and take time to do this, and collecting data, then we can start to see trends, what the trends are like with certain levels of heat and humidity and wet bulb globe temperature. The one study that I did find that talked about the impacts, 1992. So again, another indication we need to be more current in our research and our programs. I'm often asked by race directors or people that want me to come in and design medical programs is, well, what do you need? How many medical volunteers? How many tents? What kind of supplies and equipment do you need? And that's very difficult because, as you know, there are variables. There are variables as far as the field size, the distance of the event itself, 5K, 10K, what time of year it's run. Again, all those variables come into place. And I use this number based on what I would consider a summer 10K. And I'm going to go into specifics in a little bit, but you can see that, that's a significant amount of people to treat in what could be 2.5 hour period of time during a race, what we call the surge capacity. So you need to make sure that as you're designing your medical program, your medical director, your medical coordinator is able to look at that, predict it, and see what the ranges are, highs and lows. And from there, understand, okay, we're going to need 100 medical volunteers. I need so many doctors and nurses. How many AEDs? Again, there's not enough research in the industry, and this is where I'm going to ask your help later on. There's not enough research in the industry to make that determination. I'm doing this based on 40 years of, getting my feet wet on this, but there needs to be more science behind it. So when you go back to heat, how do we measure it? How do we measure that impact on an event? What, as race directors and medical directors, are you going to use to say, okay, this is my threshold? I mean, do any of you in the events have the discussion, well, if the temperature gets to this level, we're not going to do it because of the impact of the public safety and your runners. I mean, your runner's safety is the most paramount thing, but again, what's that level? A lot of us don't know that. And for a lot of us, it's a sliding scale. So is it temperature? I don't think so. Is it heat index? And I'll show you what that is in a bit. To me, it's wet bulb globe. This is what most of the sporting world is using now. So when you look at it and compare heat index to wet bulb globe, multitude of different measures here. And when you look at your weather apps, I would venture to say that most of your weather apps don't have a WGBT piece on it to make you understand what that is. There are only certain weather apps that will do it. Some of them you have to actually subscribe to. But again, you've got to be able to know what that is, and you also need to be able to know what it is in advance so you can adjust your planning. So you can see the differences between heat index and wet bulb globe. Okay, it's not going to cooperate here. Oop. All right, so that's what a heat index scale looks like. So you can see what extreme versus danger versus extreme is, and it's just taking basically temperature relative humidity. So a relatively easy scale to follow. It works, but again, in my opinion, it doesn't give you enough information. Now, when you get into the wet bulb globe, this is not clean either. Again, this is where I think as an industry, we need to work on developing maybe our own scale. So this is what the military, US military uses. And if you notice at the bottom where it says extreme, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so take a look at that, and now look at what the NCAA and the NATA, these are two organizations in the United States, use. Now their black or their extreme is 82 degrees Fahrenheit. It's an 8-degree discrepancy. Why? Well, obviously the military one is designed for military men and women in uniforms, packs, I mean, very different. But it's higher. You would think it would be lower. It's not. So, again, when you look at these two things, we've got to really make a determination, again, as an industry, what is it we're going to use? Is it wet bulb globe? Whatever. We've got to come to some type of an agreement if we're going to do research and collective data collecting here to make this work. The other thing that I'd ask you when you look at your emergency action plans, and Mike kind of alluded to, I think a little bit, what's the air quality? I mean, in a lot of parts of the world, air quality plays a major role in this. So is there a threshold in regards to air quality and whether you're going to go or no go? Because respiratory issues can be just as dangerous. So what I'm going to do is basically throw three different examples at you. Here we have the Boston Marathon 2012 versus 2018. And you can see what the wet bulb globe temperature was in 12. Actually, that 81 degrees Fahrenheit was at the start. That temperature went up to 89 degrees mid-course in Wellesley at one point in time. So we were probably, I'd say 82, 84 degrees. So we were at the borderline of a red-black level. And again, the one thing that we know is that point-to-point course, there's not one temperature that's going to be consistent 26.2 miles. It's going to change, especially as you're running towards the ocean. So what's that threshold going to look like? Versus this past April, opposite extreme, low temperatures, low humidity, vicious rain, vicious wind. It was just miserably cold. So now we're going from dealing with exertional heat strokes to now hypothermia. And if you ask me which would I rather have, I'll take the cold day every day. And the reason is it is a much easier approach to medically deal with a hypothermic runner than it is a hyperthermic, hypo versus hypothermic. So it might take one or two people to start treatment and warming a runner up. But if I get a runner, again, you'll see this in a few minutes, that has exertional heat stroke, it could take up to 6 people or more. So look at that. I mean, that's 50 people in one medical tent. Imagine doing 50 of those treatments, knowing it takes time. It could take up to a half hour, 45 minutes for you to drop that temperature down. Oops, that's not good. Okay, now we go to the Falmouth Road Race. Again, I'm only using these examples to show you what the numbers are looking like from us when we're looking at, again, temperatures, wet bulb globe, and just the differences. So obviously in 2015, very high year. We had a surge capacity that really just crippled us for a couple of hours. And to have 40 exertional heat strokes in one tent in a small race of 12,000 people, significant numbers. And again, we dealt with it. And I can tell you right now, every runner that we ever treated with exertional heat stroke in any of my events have all lived. Every one of them have gone home. Maybe not right away, but they all went home. So again, you can see what Falmouth looks like. And again, Falmouth is an August 10K, actually a 7-miler, in the heat of the day, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'd love to see them start probably early. I know a lot of your events around the world are starting much earlier, and you're mitigating some of those heat issues, but that doesn't always work. Beach to Beacon, this is up in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. This is Joni Benoit's 10K, a wonderful event, probably one of my more favorite of the year. Don't tell Tom Groke that, though. That, again, 7,000 people, This past August, 108 people were treated in 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's a mass casualty event. That's a lot of people coming into a tent that had maybe 40 beds in it that we were able to turn over, basically 2.5 times and put 30 people in ice immersion tubs. Out of those 30, only 2 went to the hospital. And they, again, all lived. So, again, it's about prevention. It's about education. Not only understanding what Mother Nature will do, but being able to prepare based on what the weather is giving us. So we've seen is, again, quickly, too hot, heat strokes, too cold, hypothermia. With the rain, with the wind, Mike did a great job, and I'm going to, not to go into it, but, certain levels of wind are going to cause problems, and just the wind alone are going to cause havoc on your medical tents and your support structures, your signage. All of those things have to be discussed. Electrical storms, that's a whole different ballgame. If you're dealing with the fact that you have a front coming through, and what do you do? I mean, do you start the race or you hold? If you've got 30,000 people in Hopkinton, and there's a storm that's maybe about 20 or 30 minutes out, and is going to cross either in Hopkinton or somewhere along that course line, do you fire the gun? My answer to Dave is absolutely not. Because once they're gone, what are you going to do with them? Mike's right. I mean, Boston has a number of shelters and programs in place to try to get people off, but how quickly? If you're in, some of the smaller events, we had this happen at the Beach to Beacon this past August. Friday night, we had a kids race, and we had a storm come through. And, I had to make the determination personally for Dave to say, okay, we have to get out. We have to evacuate. Well, how much time do I need? Do I need 10 minutes, 20 minutes, a half an hour, based on the people that are there? If I don't have shelters, how do we deal with that? All of that has to be in your emergency action plan and your planning. And again, it's not always perfect. We already talked about the other two, so we'll skip that. So pre-event planning, weather can determine what we call your surge capacity medically. It is an indication to me about how many staff, medical equipment needs that I have, whether it be on the course, the start, or the finish. Again, everything that we do in this regard, particularly as it relates to weather, also comes into play with public safety. We want public safety to be in lockstep with everything that we're doing, and also with us, with them. And then you should have that pre-planned educational planning. And again, Mike referenced that the volunteers have to be a major part of that education. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but again, this is what I would see as a weather emergency action plan. So you need to establish who is the chain of command, who is going to be the person in your event that is going to be the kind of weather monitor. And when do you start that? For us, it's always about a week or 10 days out that we start to take a look at the forecast, what's going to happen, and what do we want to start doing. And then once we see that there could be an issue, we are probably meeting every day or every other day, whether it be in conference calls or in conference rooms, in determining what adjustments need to happen. That has to be with not only your race leadership, your medical leadership, and your public safety. You have to have that reliable means. I mean, look, we all have apps on our phones. Are these reliable? I'm not so sure. I mean, they may or may not be. So do you have someone from a national weather service or a governmental weather service in your event working with you to make that determination? Trust me, I have had conversations with weather forecast folks from Boston, and they had the same problem we do. They'll tell you, Chris, I'm not sure. It's not an exact science. Well, they get paid for it. I don't. But that's what you have to deal with. So again, it's understanding all of those different pieces that come into play. Mike had referenced the EAS system, the flagging system. I think this is a great system. I think a lot of events should take a look at it in regards to warning your runners and educating your runners pre-event about weather changes and things that can happen. I will be honest with you, we have not adopted this in Boston. And for the simple reason, and again, this is just maybe my bias, is that if you've been to Boston, you know that the streets are extremely narrow. The course is narrow. So if I'm putting up a 15 or 20-foot feather flag that needs to be changed based on what we're seeing with weather, I have to rely on my volunteers to do it, and I have to make sure that the runner is going to see it. Doesn't work for us. So what we do is we use highway construction signs, the big 10 by 8 or whatever they are, electronic signs that we can change remotely. and talk about what the runner needs to do. We can say high heat, slow down. If we have to do a course disruption, we can do that. We have a multitude of things in place, but I've always felt the highway signs are the better way to go. I know we use them. I think Houston used to use them, but I think they're going back to the flagging system. So the last part of my presentation, I want to talk about two heat strokes, two situations that took place this past July. The first one was on July 1st in New York, trail run, a small event, 100 runners, but again, still significant in the sense it was an event. I'm not sure why the race director felt the need to run it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but he did. Massive mistake. And you can see what the temperature looked like. 2 days later, I am providing medical coverage at Gillette Stadium, with which I think you've heard of the New England Patriots, 5-time Super Bowl champion. Okay, we won't go there. At Gillette Stadium, and we had 36,000 runners, 3,600 runners, excuse me. Time of day was 7 o'clock, temperature 90 degrees, same temperature, wet bulb globe. I couldn't get that for the New York event. Heat index up, so it was just as hot. And trust me when I tell you, we had multiple discussions about go or no go and how we were going to approach this. So those are the two events. So New York event, 30-year-old male. Report said he was in great shape, no underlying medical conditions, collapses at the finish line. Ambulance crew responds, so I'm going to assume, and I believe this was the case, there was no regular race medical program. There was just an ambulance. They took what they call a tympanic, which is through the air thermometer, to check his temperature at 104. Got him to the hospital, and then they determined with a rectal thermometer he was 108. So that's what happened there. Finished at the 50, 40-year-old male, no underlying conditions. The one thing that was very interesting about this case, and I didn't know it till after I had interviewed the gentleman, is he rode his bike from Boston to Foxborough. It's a 45-mile bike ride prior to running the event. So you can imagine his core temperature was already elevated, and I think this was the reason why he developed exertional heat stroke. Collapsed prior to the finish line. We pick him up, we bring him into the tent, go right to a rectal temperature. He started at 104 Fahrenheit, went up to 108.2. Put him in an ice immersion tub, then he started to get combative. We had to actually physically hold him in the tub. We brought him down to 98 degrees, got him in an ambulance, sent him to the hospital. Unfortunately, the New York runner died. He died in the hospital. Our runner went home 4 hours after he was admitted to the ED. And I have to admit, when I see these things happen, it just makes me sick that this is a preventable fatality. I don't care how small this event was, and I hate to say it, but there were mistakes made. And I think, again, as an industry, as a medical person, it's not difficult to do what I'm going to show you, to deal with exertional heat stroke. So again, going back real quickly, there are multiple types of heat illness. Heat exhaustion is the level below exertional heat stroke, where the body core temperature is below 104 degrees Fahrenheit. You get all these different things, but the main thing that I've underlined here, there are no mental status changes. Your ability to communicate and understand your surroundings are there, all right? But understand, and we've seen this, we can start off with heat exertion and your body core temperature can go up. So that's why we continuously monitor. Exertional heat stroke, body core temperature now above 104. Now understand, I've seen reports. There was one event in Massachusetts, a runner had a 105.7 body core temp, was not cooled immediately. He died 9 months later. I've had the highest body core temperature I've ever treated personally was a 111.1 Fahrenheit at a 10K. We did the exact thing that I'm going to show you. He walked out of a hospital a week later because it took a long time for his kidneys and liver to reset. So when you're at that body core temperature, 104 and higher, your blood is too hot. Your brain cells, your liver, your kidney are all, those cells are now being destroyed. And if it goes too long, irreversible. Either permanent damage, we're on dialysis, or death. And it happens more than we like to admit. So it's imperative that when you put your medical plan together in dealing with this, that you know you've got a 30-minute window. So our protocol, and again, we have to work this out with public safety and EMS, don't put them in an ambulance. You have to cool them on site. Hospitals do not have the same ability that we do. So it's vital you're doing it on site and then transporting. So a lot of EMS people will say, no, we'll put them in an ambulance and away you go. Well, you could be looking at a 5 to 15-minute ride in the ambulance. Then you could be in processing at the ED. You could be waiting. They're not going to put you in an ice immersion tub. They're going to put ice in your axilla, your groin, maybe your head. It's not going to cool your body quick enough. So again, imperative that we're doing these things. And then the one thing that I've indicated down below is that when you're talking, some of the people think that you have exertional heat stroke, you're dry. No, that's not the case. A lot of these runners are sweaty, they're wet. The only time you may see that if you're in the Sahara for weeks at a time and you're completely dehydrated, but for the most part, you're still sweating. So I've really kind of went through this, so I'm going to skip this slide for a second. So, all right, can we go back and start? Can we reset that? All right, so what this is, this was taken at the Boston Marathon about 3 years ago. This runner came in unconscious, body core temperature of 1077. So at Boston, we have a designated area in our medical tent we call the heat deck. And that heat deck, as you see this tub, that is a 50-gallon ice immersion. It's called a stock tank. So basically, it's a tank that farmers use for livestock. And we're able to put about 30 gallons of water in it and then ice, and then be able to pick up the athlete and put him in that tub to make sure that basically from his neck to his groin, as you can see, are in water. Now, the other thing I want to point out, you can see on the lower right, that little device that lady is holding, that is what they call a Therm rectal thermometer. The white probe that you see, which she's holding away from the athlete, is in his rectum. And that is giving them continuously monitoring his body core temperature. So we get him to the cot, we'll do our vitals, we'll start the rectal thermometer, get his initial rectal temperature. We know that he's unconscious, so he has some mental status changes, and then in the tub. And then once he's in the tub, I kind of look at this as what we call reverse cooking. So once his body core temperature starts to come down to 102, then we take him out. Can we continue with the... So you can see that the team, and again, remember I said they could take up to 6 people? This is an easier one to deal with because this runner is not combative. He's actually starting to come back to us. And the lady at the head is actually starting to talk to him as he's coming back into consciousness. Here doing that. So the one thing that she's not doing that if I would have corrected this, she needs to get a towel on his head to cool his head just as much as we're trying to cool the body. And again, as I said, this is an easy case. I've had multiple cases we've actually had to lay across the tub and physically restrain people in it, because if they don't, they're going to die. I had one runner, actually it was the 111 that I mentioned before, that we were cooling. We started to get him down from 111 to 108. Then the nurse said to me, he's gone into arrest. Stop breathing. She didn't know about the heart, but she felt that he had stopped breathing. Oh, God. So I said, all right, fine, we'll get the AED, we'll dry him off, and we'll see what happens. So I turn around, I take a step to go get the AED, and all of a sudden this runner pops out of the tub and starts to run. Honest to God, I had to tackle him. I'm not a big guy. So thank God I had a couple of paramedics next to me, but we had to tackle him and put him back in. His body core temperature was still 108.8, and he was that combative. And when I was able to interview him after the fact at the hospital, I said, what were you doing? What were you thinking? And he says, I kept feeling like I was getting attacked by a group of people, and I needed to fake that I was dead. Okay, but that's what is happening to your brain that you just don't understand. So, again, I've had people punched, bitten, kicked, my medical staff. That's how bad it can get. So, again, this is a true medical emergency. So, again, I've kind of went through all that. Again, brain cells begin to die. It's just a problem. And this is something that, again, is extremely preventable. So key points, and I'm going to wrap this up, understanding weather and the impact on weather. And obviously, if you take anything away from today, understanding what exertional heat stroke now looks like, and going back to your medical teams to say, are we dealing with this? Do you have the proper equipment? When you look back at the video of the heat stroke we were dealing with, that tub cost $75. The thermometer cost $250. So is that amount of money worth saving one of your runner's life? I think the answer is yes. But you have to have similar equipment to be able to do that. And it's not like you need a lot, but you have to be able to approach it. We talked about, and again, I kind of stayed away from the emergency action plan, but again, this all has to be in the plan and how you're dealing with it. And then, communications, which I didn't get into as much as I want. Mike did that. Whether it be amateur radio, commercial radios, we are dealing now more with emergency text messaging programs. We instituted a company called Everbridge with the Boston Marathon. It's an international company that deals with emergency text messaging, that we're able to push out, as Mike mentioned, a multitude of pre-planned messages to either everybody or certain groups. Vitally important for us. So last thing I want to talk about is circle back to the International Institute for Race Medicine. And this is where I need your help. Again, with AIM's leadership, we've done a couple of things. One of the things we started that we developed a grant. The Matthew Good Foundation, which is one of our supporting organizations financially, said to us, Chris, we need events to join. So what we've done to all AIMS members, and not all have taken us up on this, is that you have the ability to join the IIRM for 1 year for free. And what that means is that you have basically all of the educational materials, and that includes documents. It includes a 120-page medical manual on all the different types of injuries and problems that you might see. It includes 20 educational videos, almost in the sense of distance learning platform. We have, if your medical team is interested, we have an app. Everyone's got an app that you could buy for $1 that will give you all of our medical protocols, in quick reference. So again, what we're trying to do is work with you to develop the standards of care. The other thing that I forgot to mention that we have is that we have a post-race reporting tool. So your medical staff, whether they're a member or not, can start to data input what you experienced medically after your event. What was the temperature? How many people were treated in the medical tents? How many people were transported? How many exertional heat strokes? This is the data that we need to plan for the future. And I'm asking your help, because if you have 400 and some odd event members, I would love to see all 400 members join us at some point in time, or at least take a look. Give us a try for a year. And after the year, yes, we will ask you to join us, and that cost is $250 a year. But that cost allows not only your medical leadership, but all of your medical volunteers, no matter how many, including the EMS and hospitals that support your event, to have access to that. So there's no limitation once you join for that access. And again, we continue to grow. We'll add more material. And just recently, about 3 weeks ago, we were approached by the IAAF, Dr. Stefan Berman, who is one of the medical directors for that group. And they came to me and they came to Paco and basically said, look, we want to work with both of your organizations to create standards of care for the industry. So the IAAF recognizes what we're doing. Obviously, they've known what AIMS has been doing for a long period of time. And I think together, we can help so many events and so many athletes in making sure what is inherently a safe industry, even safer. Thank you for your time.